Hey everybody. This video is going to go over the PowerPoint in the week 6 module on chapter 11, Compare and Contrast. So in the week 5 module, we looked at evaluation paragraphs and process analysis paragraphs. We are going to continue this week looking at a couple more different rhetorical patterns that you can use when writing a paragraph. And chapter 11 is about comparing and contrasting, something that we are all very familiar with, something that is an everyday thought process for us. We know what comparing and contrasting is. When we compare things, we're looking at how they are similar. When we contrast things, we're looking at how they are different. Some of the information that we're covering in this PowerPoint is not going to be new information. What might be new, though, is taking that knowledge we already have of comparing and contrasting and learning how to apply it to a formal paragraph using compare and contrast. Right? We can compare and contrast all sorts of things. You could compare or contrast two brand name products like Nike versus New Balance shoes. You could look at two television shows or two movies or two musical acts like or bands or groups. You could look at instructors or bosses. You could look at jobs or schools or friends or family members. The variety of topics available for comparing and contrasting is vast. So you're going to have all sorts of topics that you could choose from to write your paragraph on, but what you need to understand is that there is a purpose to comparing and contrasting. We're seeking a better understanding of the topics you've chosen to look at, and we have a specific reason for doing so. So we're going to look at the different purposes for comparing and contrasting. But first, on slide 3, I just wanted to point out that sometimes we engage in compare and contrast, even though those words aren't necessarily being used. So, for instance, we have some sample questions on slide 3. The first sample question, it actually does use the words compare and contrast. It's very direct. So compare and contrast the apple characteristics which determine if the apple is a gala apple or a Honeycrisp. Right? We understand that very clearly. It's directly asking us to compare or contrast. But the next question, though, it says, what characteristics distinguish the right lung from the left lung? So we're going to be contrasting there, but the word contrast was not used in the question. But that's still what we're going to do. That's still what the question is asking us to do. Same thing with the third question. What is the difference between allopathy and homeopathy? It's saying differences, but the word contrast isn't being used. So just realize that sometimes we are engaging in comparing and contrasting, and we might not even realize it at first because those words weren't being used. But don't let it fool you. You know what it means to look at differences or look at similarities. That's what it's all about. So what you are trying to do, though, is give a better understanding of both topics. Or here's another way to look at it. The underlying purpose between comparing and contrasting. You might be looking at two things that are thought to be similar, but are actually quite different. So most everybody thinks these two things are just alike, that they share a lot of similarities. But you want to come in and say, actually, they might appear to be very similar on the surface, but if you look closely, they're really very different. So you're going to be focusing on the differences. You're going to be contrasting those two things to show your reader that they are also very different, even though they seem similar. Or you could go the opposite approach. Two things that are thought to be really different, you're going to show how they're actually very similar. You might look at the similarities and the differences if your purpose is to help us distinguish one from the other, learn something more about each one. More than likely, though, the purpose is going to be one of those first two, where you're going to focus on the similarities or you're going to focus on the differences. The reason that you don't want to often try to do both is you run the risk of then not being clear why you're comparing and contrasting. If you start looking at similarities and differences, then it's easier to lose the underlying purpose. So for the sake of this paragraph, and to just get more practice with comparing and contrasting, we're going to try to go with one of those two purposes I listed first, showing how two things that are thought to be similar are actually quite different, or showing how two things that are thought to be different are actually quite similar, right? Once you've picked your topics, the two things you want to compare or contrast, and you know what your purpose is. Am I wanting to focus on the similarities, or do I want to focus on the differences? The next thing you're going to want to realize about a compare-contrast paragraph is how it is organized, the method of development. So on slide 5, we have two different methods of development shown here. You can do what we call one side at a time, right? So how that method works is you look at subject A and you list all the points that you want to talk about for subject A. And then you're going to talk about subject B, and you're going to discuss all the points that you want to discuss for subject B. But the points all have to be the same, right? So point 1 for subject A has to be the same point 1 in subject, showing how those points are either similar or different, depending on which one you're focusing on. Same thing for all the rest of the points. They should match up. You're just going to talk about everything with subject A first, and then everything with subject B second. Or you can do point by point. So you're going to take your first point of comparison or contrast, and you're going to show how it is for subject A and how it is for subject B. Then you're going to go to your second point of compare or contrast. Show how it is for subject A, show how it is for subject B, or then you go on to point 3, show how it is for subject A, show how it is for subject B. Notice how organized the points are for both. Everything needs to match up. So even though in one side at a time, you're discussing everything about subject A first, it needs to match up exactly with subject B. When you're going point by point, you talk about subject A first, and then you talk about subject B. And you keep that order as you discuss each point you're looking at. We're going to take a look at examples that use both methods of development. So it'll start to clarify once we get some paragraphs to look at. On slide 6, we have sort of another visual of those methods of development. So if you look at the image that's there, on the left-hand side, you have what this is calling the block method of organization. This is what we call one side at a time, right? So our topic here is my two cousins are very different. So we're focusing on the differences. We're contrasting. Our first cousin that we're going to talk about is Joanne. We're going to discuss and give examples of Joanne's appearance, and then we're going to discuss examples of Joanne's personality, and then we're going to discuss examples of Joanne's hobbies and interests. Then we're going to look at the second cousin, Mary. We're going to give examples of Mary's appearance, and then Mary's personality, and then Mary's hobbies and interests. So here you have a visual of how the points match up. We're looking at the same 3 areas for both cousins. So we're not going to say my two cousins are very different and then talk about Joanne's appearance, personality, and hobbies, and then look at, Mary's and say we're going to look at Mary's grades in school, the kind of cars that she drives, and the kind of boyfriends that she's had. Though you're not looking at the same differences to show that your cousins are different. So in order to truly show that your cousins are very different, you have to look at the appearance for both of them, the personality of both of them, and the hobbies and interests for both of them. Or you could have done it point by point. My two cousins are very different. They're very different in appearance. Here's how Joanne's appearance is. Here's how Mary's appearance is. They're also very different in their personalities. Here's a little bit about Joanne's personality. Here's a little bit about Mary's personality, showing how they're different. Then finally, they are also different in their hobbies and interests. Here are Joanne's hobbies and interests, and in contrast, here are Mary's hobbies and interests, right? It's not very difficult. You just have to remember to keep it organized in the same pattern the whole way through, no matter which method of development you use, right? Outlining is especially useful for compare-contrast to make sure that you get the same order all the way through, right? So on slide 7, we have a sample paragraph here, the United States Congress, 2 branches, and you can read through that paragraph if you haven't already. And then on slide 8, we have an outline of that paragraph. And that outline shows us that that paragraph used the one side at a time method, right? So the topic was the United States Congress, the federal government's lawmaking branch, is made up of 2 different bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives. So then we looked at the Senate first. We looked at how many members it has, how the members are elected, how long they serve, and who the leader of the Senate is, right? Those 4 points. Then we moved on to talk about the House of Representatives. We also looked at how many members there are, how they're elected, how long they serve, and who the leader is for the House, right? So it matches up perfectly. On slide 9, you have another sample paragraph, good and bad horror movies. You can read through that paragraph, and then on slide 10, we also have an outline of that paragraph, and when we look at that outline, we can see that that paragraph used the point-by-point method. So the topic for that paragraph, topic sentence was, a good horror movie is easily distinguished from a bad one. The first point of difference we looked at were kinds of victims. We saw good horror movies, they have male and female victims, so everyone has a chance to identify, but bad horror movies usually only have female victims, and they're clearly prejudiced. The second point of contrast was the effect on the audience. We saw that good horror movies have compassion and empathy. Bad horror movies have aggression and violence. Then we went to the third point of contrast, the tone. We saw that good horror movies have humor that provides relief and humanizes the characters, but bad horror movies are pretty humorless and actually kind of boring, according to the paragraph. So it matched up perfectly, and we could clearly see the differences being pointed out for each of the points of contrast. On slide 12, we get into more sample paragraphs. This first one here on slide 12 is called My Broken Dream. When I became a police officer in my town, the job was not as I had dreamed it would be. I began to dream about being a police officer at about age 10. I could picture myself wearing a handsome blue uniform with an impressive-looking badge on my chest, the outfit I wore. I could also picture myself driving a powerful patrol car through town and seeing everyone stare at me with envy. Number 2. But most of all, I dreamed of wearing a gun and using all the equipment that TV cops use. 3. I knew everyone would be proud of me. I could almost hear the guys on the block saying, "Boy, Steve made it big. Did you hear he's a cop?" Point number 4. I dreamed of leading an exciting life, solving big crimes and meeting lots of people. 5. I knew that if I became a cop, everyone in town would look up to me. However, when I actually did become a police officer, I soon found out that the reality was different. My first disappointment came when I was sworn in and handed a well-used, baggy uniform. The first point matches up. My disappointment continued when I was given a badge that looked like something pulled out of a cereal box. I was assigned a beat-up old junker and told it would be my patrol car. Matches up still. It had a striking resemblance to a car that had lost in a demolition derby at a stock car raceway. Disappointment seemed to continue. I soon found out that I was not the envy of all my friends. When I drove through town, they acted as if they had not seen me, despite the gun and nightstick at my side. I was told I was crazy doing this kind of job by people I thought would look up to me. My job was not as exciting as I had dreamed it would be either. Instead of solving robberies and murders every day, I found that I spent a great deal of time comforting a local resident because a neighborhood dog had watered his favorite bush. Right? It's very casual, right? Very um, personal, but you can still see the contrast that's happening, what he imagined it was going to be like versus the reality of it, and he matches the points up perfectly. Even though he's almost like telling a little story in a way, it still matches up. Two views on toys, right? Children and adults have very different preferences. First, there is the matter of taste. Adults pride themselves on taste while children ignore the matter of taste in favor of things that are fun. Adults, especially grandparents, pick out tasteful toys that go unused, while children love the cheap playthings advertised on television. Second, of course, there is the matter of money. The new games on the market today are a case in point. Have you ever tried to lure a child away from some expensive game in order to get him or her to play with an old-fashioned game or toy? Finally, there is a difference between an adult's and child's idea of what is educational. Adults filled with memories of their own childhood tend to be fond of the written word. Today's children, on the other hand, concentrate on anything electronic. These things mean much more to them than to adults. Next holiday season, examine the toys that adults choose for children. Then look at the toys the children prefer. You will see the difference. We're going to look at this one a little closer here in just a minute. Then we have our third example, ice hockey and soccer. Like ice hockey, soccer is a game whose aim is scoring goals against the opposing team. Both are team sports in which the most important position is that of goaltender or goalie. This is the player who defends the team's goal or net. Unlike ice hockey, which is played on an indoor ice rink or a frozen pond or lake, soccer is played outside on a grassy field. In an ice hockey match, only 6 players from each team can be on the ice at one time. Ice hockey players wear a lot of protective equipment such as helmets, shin guards, and padded gloves. In a soccer match, each team fields 11 players. Both sports require a great deal of energy. Ice hockey players seem to be constantly in motion, and soccer players race up and down the field almost nonstop. However, they wear little protective gear. Their uniforms consist of soccer shoes, socks, shorts, and jerseys. We had some questions to answer on slide 15 about those 3 paragraphs. Which paragraph lacks a topic sentence? Which paragraph has a topic sentence that is too broad? Which paragraph contains almost no specific details? Which paragraph provides the most complete support? Which one or ones, or which method is used in My Broken Dream, one side at a time or point by point? Which method is used in Two Views on Toys? In which paragraph offers specific details but lacks a clear, consistent method of organization? Well, if you go back and look, ice hockey and soccer totally lacks a topic sentence. It starts with, like ice hockey, soccer is a game whose aim is scoring goals against the opposing team. That just tells us about how they score. It doesn't give us a topic sentence about what the paragraph is going to discuss. Which one has a topic sentence that is too broad? That would be Two Views on Toys. If you go back and look at that one, children and adults have very different preferences. Preferences about what? That can mean anything. So it's too broad. It doesn't tell us specifically which preferences we're going to talk about in the paragraph. Which one contains almost no specific details? That would be Two Views on Toys. If you go back and look, they say things, but they don't give us specific examples. They don't really talk about the matter of taste. They just say that adults and children have different tastes. They don't necessarily give us specific examples. Same thing with when they talk about the cost. They have some good ideas, but they don't give enough specific examples to support each point they're looking at. My Broken Dream is the one that provides the most support. The one about his what he imagined it would be like to be a cop versus the reality of it. And that one uses this one side at a time method. He talks about his vision of it, what he thought it would be like, and then he talks about the reality. Two views on toys, even though it still needs supporting details, it is organized well. It uses the point-by-point method. So we look at taste, money, and education, or educational toys. He just needs more specific examples. Ice hockey and soccer, that's the one. They offer specific examples, but it is not organized in any solid way. They're kind of all over the place. Sometimes it seems like they're going to go point by point. You know, they're going to say something about ice hockey and then show how it's different in soccer. And then sometimes it seems like they switched and went one side at a time, because he'll say two things about ice hockey and then move on and start talking about something else with soccer. A lot of specific details, but not organized properly. So keep some of those errors in mind. Make sure you have a focused topic sentence, not a broad general idea of what the paragraph is going to be about, but a very specific, laser focused topic sentence. Make sure that you're very clear about your points of similarity or points of difference. Make sure that you have chosen, are you doing it one side at a time or point by point? Make sure that you stay consistent regardless of which method you use. Make sure you provide specific supporting examples for each of your points, right? Whether you do it one side at a time or point by point, the specific examples have to be there, right? In the rest of the PowerPoint, it goes through one student's process of getting to her final compare-contrast paragraph. And hopefully you paid attention to some of the things that, some of her choices she made along the way. Interesting, one of the choices that she made was, at first she had decided to draft the paragraph using the point-by-point method. And so she had it outlined and everything and started drafting it, and then realized in the middle of her draft that she actually didn't think it was working out so well to go point by point. And it dawned on her that going one side at a time would actually work better. So she went back, she outlined it going one side at a time instead, and then started drafting the paragraph. And just keep that in mind. You need to make a decision right away before you start drafting. You need to make a decision. Am I going to go one side at a time or point by point? And then start working on the draft. But realize you can change your mind. It's your paragraph. That does mean you have to kind of go back and regroup and start drafting from the beginning again. But it would be better to do that than end up with a paragraph that doesn't really work because you ended up choosing the method that didn't best support what you were trying to accomplish. So you need to make that decision up front, but just know that it can be changed if you realize it's not working as well as you had hoped, right? That's probably the biggest thing out of her process that I want you to take away from it. But also thinking about just how she went about the revisions. You can see when you read what the feedback was, right? But what you need to keep in mind is just, we're all used to comparing and contrasting. It's nothing new to us. But you need to be sure that you're taking that familiar concept and applying it appropriately in a formal compare and contrast paragraph. Make sure that you understand what your underlying purpose is. Are you wanting to show that two things that everybody else thinks are similar are actually pretty different? Or are you wanting to show that two things that everyone thinks are totally different are actually pretty similar? What are you going to focus on? The similarities or the differences, and why. Then come up with your points of compare and contrast. What are the areas where they're similar, or what are the areas where they're different? Once you have decided which 3 or 4 points you're going to focus on, then decide which method of development. Do I want to talk one side at a time, or do I want to go point by point? Make the best decision you can in that moment, and then outline it, right? Just jot down which one you're going to do in that order, right? You're going to do one side at a time. Start with your first subject and jot down the 3 or 4 points that you're going to look at. And then your second subject and the same 3 or 4 points you're going to look at. Then you can start drafting. If you're going to do point by point, what's your first point you're going to look at? Jot down what it is for subject A and what it is for subject B. What's the second point of similarity or difference you're going to look at? Jot it down for subject A, jot it down for subject B, so on and so forth. Just so you have a little visual reminder of how you want the paragraph to be organized. Then start drafting. If you get into the draft and realize that that method of development isn't working so well, you can change it, right? If you realize that the points of similarities aren't working out so well, go back and start thinking of different ones to use instead. But when you are finished with the draft, it should have a clear topic sentence, laser focused. It should have a clear method of development, and you should have specific examples for each point that you're discussing. It should have a concluding sentence, right? So use the successful paragraphs that are on the PowerPoint in the chapter. Use those to your advantage as guides, but really go back to those slides in the beginning where the methods of development are laid out for you and how to outline the paragraph to make sure that you stay on track. All right. If you have any comments or questions about comparing and contrasting, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the next item in the weekly module.